Hey, I'm just quickly jumping in here before we get into today's conversation. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Click that little bell button to get notified when the new episodes come out. And if you'd like to support Paramount Importance even further, please check out our website, paramountimportance.com. We've got some awesome merch there. They've got these cool shirts, these cool hats, all environmentally friendly and the highest quality we could go. It generally helps us keep on doing what we are doing, spreading the word of science, inspiring a whole bunch more people. It really helps us out. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Let's go. Paramount Importance. What we're going to be talking about today is burning in native bushlands. Why is fire important for Australian landscapes?
Fire has been part of this landscape in southwestern Australia for 5 or 6 million years at least. And it is a natural part of many parts of this landscape. It plays an important role as a disturbance in many parts of those landscapes. So landscapes have these cycles of disturbance and growth and change, and fire is part of those cycles, I guess. And there's also been anthropogenic fire in this landscape for at least 50,000 years. Which is also a really important part of the disturbance cycles in some places as well.
What do you mean by anthropogenic fire?
Fires set by humans.
Right, okay. So cultural burning, like the Indigenous, like you said 50,000 years ago, that still classes as like anthropogenic? I know like humans, but it's like, though it's like the bushland, they were doing it as like, it was all in cycle, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's still set by humans, I guess, and for, Yeah. I guess like what's a natural ignition source? Lightning.
Yeah. Okay.
And the fire regimes that are driven by lightning quite different to what those set by humans, because they can occur at different times of the year. They can occur in different places with other different weather systems going on. Like to get a bushfire from lightning, you need dry lightning usually.
What's dry lightning?
Lightning without rain.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so the resulting fire regime, I guess, which is the return interval, the size, the intensity, those kinds of indices is different when humans are controlling those ignitions.
Yeah, I guess I kind of got confused with like anthropogenic usually is like negative pressures from more dealing in recent landscapes of like estuaries with all pollution and like that's all anthropogenic human stuff. So I think
that's a really common perspective for ecologists, natural scientists, conservationists to have, and it's something that is a really key learning that's occurred for me through being exposed to Indigenous worldviews and in particular working with Menang and Mereninga and Goring Elders on the south coast, and the perspective that country actually needs people to look after it, and there's one beautiful story from Uncle Noel Nannup who talks about how humans came to be the carers of everything on country in Noongar Elders, and it talks through all the different animals who could have cared for everything, and in the end it's humans that are given this responsibility and obligation to care for all the elements of country. And it's a completely different view to how we understand human roles in landscape usually. I think that's sort of starting to change, but definitely the environmental education that I had was more that humans are detrimental, that humans usually cause harm, and that we need to manage human pressures rather than encourage people to interact with landscapes.
Right. And so the term of looking after country, what was he meaning by that in more specific details?
It's probably a question for Uncle Noel, I guess.
Yeah, okay.
You can access that story online.
Okay, yeah.
So listeners might be interested to do that. But I think it's about, my understanding would be that it's about making decisions. All your everyday decisions are made in line with that being the overarching goal and the reason for your existence.
Okay. I'm going to jump back to the bushland.
Mhm.
What are the plant responses to fire?
Yeah, so plants respond in a variety of ways to fire. In southwestern Australia, we have plants that respond in many ways. Some plants die in response to even relatively low intensity fires, and those plants usually regrow from seed, whether that's seed in a soil seed bank or in a canopy stored seed bank. And then other plants can resprout after fire. So a lot of Australian plants, in particular, quite a few of the eucalypts, the big trees that we have here, are known for responding to fire through epicormic buds, so buds under the bark that can grow after disturbances. But it's not necessarily just fire. They can also do this after extreme wind conditions or anything that harms the plant.
Right, epicormic. I've got it. Yeah, but so it's that that's like the little little shoots that are coming off the tree, and you're saying that's under the bark.
Yeah, it sits on the
right. Okay, because bark sort of acts as like a protective barrier of trees, right? So and it's like a lot of the plants have adapted. I might be wrong with this, but adapted to fire. So when fire's burning up the tree, they just like shed their bark and then keeps their trunk safe. Is that?
Yeah, it can act. I guess sort of insulation is not really the right word, but yeah, as like a protective layer, I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah, but it doesn't. It's not necessarily justify. There's a number of disturbances to which you see that kind of response, and listeners who've driven past a recent bushfire will see when the trees, like you get this really vibrant green growth sprouting from all heights along the tree. So you might have had this really high canopy before, and then you end up with green growth all the way along the trunk. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like I think most people that have driven around in the Australian bushland would probably recognise that. Yep. Now, like you lose a lot of that top canopy. In terms of the ecosystem changes, like our bushland isn't quite the same as what it used to be, right? We've got a lot thicker understory. We've got loss of canopy. How has like fire changed in our like landscapes now?
Yeah, so I think something that we talk about a lot in the work that we do is the change in structure of landscapes, in particularly in forests and woodland sort of systems. If you look at historic photographs from the southwest, you can see just absolutely ginormous jarrah trees in particular that were logged. And the stories are of people driving cattle and riding horses through these park-like forested areas, particularly jarrah forest. And now you go through those areas that have been logged and you see, regrowth from 1960 this and 1970 that, and you see this quite dense stands of smaller trees rather than fewer larger trees. So logging was a big impact on the structure of those systems, and fire is also part of that story, I suppose. I guess it's sort of hard to talk generally across the southwest because it's so diverse and the structure of vegetation is also diverse. But yeah, talking particularly about those sorts of forests, I suppose. I guess the anthropogenic pressures changed with colonisation, and that changed anthropogenic disturbance regimes. And how that changed fire, I mean, we don't have an accurate understanding of what regimes were like before. We have some ideas prior to colonisation, but we can't say for sure this was the exact regime everywhere in these forests. So how it's changed, it's hard to accurately quantify, I suppose, but generally there was a period of fire suppression. So wildfires were suppressed, and also anthropogenic burning in public lands was suppressed. So in 1847, a Ordnance Act was passed which banned burning on public lands from October to April, which is sort of, I guess the second half of that is sort of peak Noongar burning time, that early autumn time. And so a lot of intentional fires were not lit after that, I guess, also through depopulation of Noongar people from those areas. And then it wasn't probably until, I guess our current prescribed burning program in the forests sort of took off after the Second World War.
Right. Okay. Why?
There's quite a few factors that, like all history, things converge.
Yeah.
Large fires in the early 60s in the forested region of Southwest Australia, and also just some of the technology and what do you call that stuff? Like machinery, I guess, like airplanes returned from war and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you say large fires in the 60s? Was there a particular reason?
I'm not really sure. It's not
Okay.
I'm not sure. I probably don't know enough about it really, but 1960, 61 summer, that there was large fires in Dwelling Up, and I think that there'd always been proponents of landscape burning, of light burning or of prescribed burning.
Okay. What are the typical regimes for fire we have now, and I guess we've just talked about a bit about the past of it. How is it different now to what it was?
Yeah, so typically now, I guess you have we still have wildfire, obviously, that's part of this landscape, and we also have a prescribed burning program in Western Australia. A lot of that is focused in the forest, but it is also applied to other landscapes as well. And then there's also sort of other like landholders and smaller reserves that are managed as well through controlled fire predominantly.
How connected is everyone together in terming when to burn, where to burn, how to burn?
I guess through control of the conservation estate, which is quite large in Southwestern Australia, DBCA, our state department for conservation, can apply a strategic lens to their fire management across their estate. Outside of that, it's quite hard to cooperate across jurisdictions, I guess. There's some wonderful examples, for example, from the Kimberley, where the collaboration cross tenure for fire management is setting a wonderful example with First Nations people working with station owners, working with Parks and Wildlife to come together to have a more strategic approach to that landscape. So where we've been working recently between the Fitzgerald River and the Stirling Range National Park is a very fragmented landscape. There's some relatively big conservation reserves. There's some small conservation reserves, and a lot of them have farms as neighbours on 3 or 4 sides. So working together across tenure in that landscape is really important and something that is probably, part of the future of the work that we've been doing there.
Right. You explore, a lot of your research is with that elder-led Noongar burns and the two-way learning between Indigenous knowledge and Western science. What has surprised you most when you've started working in that space?
Yeah, there's so many surprises and so many things to learn, both on a personal and sort of professional and intellectual level, I suppose. For me, the really important learnings to come out of that collaborative works so far, and I'll just recognise and thank all the people who've contributed to all the work that we've been doing as well, is just the ability of the elders who I've been lucky enough to work with to think about so many different factors when they're making decisions about caring for country, to think about how it impacts what's in front of you on a more strategic landscape scale, to think about how it impacts people, the animals that might live there, that might pass through there. I think that's just a really important takeaway for me. I feel a little bit inadequate when I think about how many factors that they are considering, and just the scale of management, I guess, which is quite a contrast to the scale of management that Nyidiyang or whitefellow organisations apply to landscapes, thinking at a reserve scale or even the whole of the forest scale, so different to the decisions that are being made at a individual plant or stand of plants or community scale.
Right. What are some of the reasons? Not reasons. I guess. Actually, no. What are some of the reasons when the Indigenous people want to burn? Like, what are they seeing when this is the time of year? This is when we should start burning.
It depends where and who you're talking to. I think one of the studies that we did as part of my PhD was led by Ani Lynette Knapp, who's a Mirninga Baradok woman from the south coast of WA. And in that study, we sat with Ani Lynette and we talked about 65 culturally important plant species that we'd observed in a about 2 kilometre traverse at Boxwood Hill. And we talked about, for all of these 65 species, when can you burn them? When can you not burn them? When might you harvest them? What are they doing throughout the year? And I went out every 3 weeks with her granddaughter, Jessica, and we recorded exactly what those 65 species were doing in that 2 kilometres every 3 weeks for a year. And then we sat down with Arnie Lynn's knowledge of how you might care for those plants and what we'd observed on country, and looked at where across the land, across different vegetation communities and across a cycle of seasons throughout the year, where might you or might you not be allowed to apply fire just based on rules for those 65 species. And so I guess I explained all of that to describe just how many decisions go into deciding whether you might apply fire. So that's just one level, I guess, is what plant resources are there and what's your relationship to those plant resources, and what rules does your family have about when you may or may not apply fire to them. And then there's animals. And then there's like a larger temporal scale, like is this tree old and needs to be replaced, or is it old and we need to protect it, or
Right. Okay. So there's so many different facets to all the different decisions. And as you said, it's like a difference between families as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like particularly, I think something that we've talked a lot about is totemic relationships to plants and animals, and what that might mean for your family's application of fire to care for or protect that plant or animal.
Right. Wow. Do you know how many families are sort of like in that area that would like need to be consulted?
I don't think I could really answer that question. But I guess something that we wrote a bit about together with Arnie Lynn, and also Uncle Aidan Eads and his brother Eugene Eads, and Annie Eliza Woods, their sister as well. They were really key in some of this work, was looking at sort of how your connection to country informs those decisions. So for some places, there's quite a few families who are connected to that place and they would all have burning rights there. And for some places, maybe only 1 or 2 families have the burning rights for that place, depending on what knowledge they hold for that place and their relationship to it. So although a family might be connected across a couple 100 kilometres of country, there's specific places within that as well that need to be considered. And for me, it just like really drives home that message of place-based decision making led by Noongar knowledge holders.
Wow.
Yep.
And you briefly mentioned the seasons.
Yeah.
Because the seasons, well, Australian seasons don't match the Western summer, autumn, winter, spring seasons. We have 6 seasons.
Yeah, so there's Wajak Noongar. So we're on Wajak Noongar country today, and there's 6 seasons here. Talking to Auntie Lynette Naff, whose country runs from the Warren River in the west all the way to Israelite Bay in the east. And working with her and her family, we have named 11 seasons for that country, or there's 11 names to describe seasonal changes throughout the year on that country.
Wow.
That they as a family use. Yeah. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it is. And like I learned from the podcast with Joe Fontaine that not always the seasons will happen.
Yeah, yep.
So some years that they don't occur, and then in those years that if there was like a certain thing that like, oh, we need, like we'll start burning. If it didn't happen, they wouldn't burn.
Yeah, yeah.
And they would know, because if they did burn, it would impact the environment not in a good way.
Yeah.
Which I thought was pretty remarkable, that connection that, you know, a lot of the Western science decisions to burn sometimes it could be a bit like
blunt.
Yeah. It's like we're burning and not taking into that amount of consideration. You mentioned in one of your papers like a semi-structured interviews and yarning with elders, fire practitioners and land care groups. How has the process of yarning changed research perspectives and compared to more conventional interviewed styles in the past? Yeah,
so yarning is an Indigenous research method. It's iterative and it's open-ended, and it's can be generative as well as also sharing of information. It's an absolutely essential method for the work that we do together. In one of the chapters of my PhD, I sort of explore how yarning not only collects data in these sorts of collaborations for caring for country, but also creates connection and ability, and I guess shares knowledge across stakeholders so that we can work together and builds those relationships and that shared knowledge base. It is also really enjoyable. And so often for us, field days look like going to a place that you want to talk about, setting up some camp chairs, boiling the billy, or bringing out the thermos, and you have a cup of tea. And it's really important that those conversations are led by elders, and that elders are, I guess, set the tone for those conversations. So you, as a Nyidyang Yoga, a white woman, I sort of sit back and let the conversation unfold. And often I'll go into these conversations with a few things that I'd like to ask. Sometimes I don't get to ask them. But as the relationships with the elders who contributed a lot to my PhD has grown, our ability to converse has also grown, and those yarns have become deeper. And with every time you sit in the same place and talk about the same theme, something new comes. And every time I listen back to the recording, I hear something new again. And it's just an incredibly rich way, I think, to have those conversations and develop that shared understanding. And I guess historically, settler researchers have extracted knowledge from Indigenous peoples. And that's really inappropriate and not okay. So the work that we do is really about generating knowledge together that answers shared questions. So yarning is an absolutely essential tool for that, because it allows us to understand where each other's at, to share our perspectives, to come together and develop what we know together, I guess, and figure out where we need to bridge gaps in understanding, or where the gaps align and where we need to therefore target our research.
You said that you would go there with some specific questions you want to ask.
Yeah.
What were some of those questions, and you said you learned something new? every time. Can you give us a few examples of some new things that you learnt that sort of surprised you that like?
Yeah, okay. So some of the questions that we might ask, I guess it just depends on what we're talking about that day. Often when we were on country burning or doing sort of caring for country activities, the elders would start and finish the camp or the day with a circle where everybody would share how they were feeling and where they were at and what they were hoping to get out of it or what they had got out of it. So I guess like as a researcher, maybe our question is, are people enjoying this experience or are people learning in this experience? But I don't necessarily have to ask it because the nature of the circle is that people share those things as a result of the space that's created and shared in those places. Something that probably is a really key takeaway from this work for me is the importance of fire in those circles. And so many of them occurred around a campfire. And something about that experience was really important for building those shared understandings and those connections in our project team.
Because fire is more than just the management.
Yeah.
It's like that cultural connection. Like
it's innately human to sit around a fire and talk.
Yeah, I call it nature's television in a way. That's at a place that I lived for a couple of years. We had no reception, no TV or anything. So me and my friends would just sit around the fire every dark.
Yeah.
And just you end up just staring into it.
Yeah.
Right, so they would, Yeah,
and a lot of the elders shared that for them, that experience took them back to sitting around the fire as kids, listening to their old people talk language and speak about country. And for them, that was their classroom, their kitchen, all those important parts of life. And so to have a fire there in those conversations was really important as well. And not just because we were talking about fire in the landscape, but for a number of other reasons as well. I also learnt to shut up and listen, which is sort of difficult for a lot settler folk usually. Which is really, really important.
We can definitely take so much knowledge, and hopefully I think we're on the path that we're becoming more collaborative in all aspects with Indigenous culture but also in science in general.
Like local knowledge is something that scientists have been historically really quick to exclude as non-scientific knowledge, but humans observe environments. People who spend time in landscapes observe things, and such important knowledge bases, and it's those people usually who are responsible for caring for them.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said earlier in the podcast. What are some of the fundamental aspirations regarding land management were voiced by the Noongar Elders, and why do they consider our current state of overgrown reserves a travesty?
Yeah, so one of the studies that I worked on was based in Denmark and looking at some shire reserves in Denmark, and we asked elders and land managers for that those reserves, what would you like to see here in terms of fire management? And one of the things that elders across 7 families talked about was, well, where are the local people caring for this place? Where are the residents whose backyards back onto this reserve caring for it? Because I can see that nobody's been caring for this place. And one of the things that they could observe was like this undergrowth that was impenetrable, snaky. And they, I guess for the elders, my interpretation is like, well, if I was living here, the old women in my family taught me that you need to clean up around your camp, you need to clean up around your house. So these people need to take responsibility to care for this place, to clean it up, to make it safe, to make it healthy. And that's what you needed for fire management in that place. You didn't need to have a prescribed burn there. What the elders their aspiration for that place was for it to be cared for.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, I don't know if you're aware, but I grew up on like a real big farming family, and my whole childhood was like spent picking up sticks through the paddocks and making a lot of fire, and in a way burning off different areas. Which, thinking back now, it wasn't to do like the only bit that was really concerned by my grandparents, I guess, was more like how fire could come through and wipe out their grass feed for the land for the livestock.
Yeah.
Not taking into account too much of the plant ecology around there. But in terms of your sayings, like for local people, looking after their places is just sort of not quite happening where it should be.
Yeah, and I think maybe just the understandings of what that looks like, it was different, in the sense that if you rely on the landscape around you, your immediate landscape, you garden it. Like, it's like if you rely on the vegetables that you grow in your backyard, you look after them.
Yeah.
Because there's no point eating a snail-ridden lettuce, you know? So I think this is this fundamentally different perspective of human roles in landscapes, like humans as part of or separate to natural processes.
What defines the ideal behaviour and intensity of traditional Noongar fire? Could you elaborate on the goal achieving of cool, slow, low, small, patchy fires and keeping flames away from the vegetation canopy?
Yeah, so what the small, slow, patchy is a result from some of the work that we did with elders, talking to them about what they wanted to see in those reserves. And I guess in answer to your question, it depends what your goal is for that particular place and where you're burning. But in general, a few rules, I guess if you can call them that, have become clear that are shared across landforms and families, which is basically a controlled fire has to be controlled without machinery or 4,000 litres of water or wearing fireproof clothing. Like, a controlled fire is a fire that you can control with a green bough or a wet hessian bag. Anything above that is an uncontrolled fire, whether it's prescribed or not, in the conversations that we've had.
Right. There's a lot of like the techniques used by our departments is like dropping little flame bombs out of aeroplanes and things. That's not exactly controlled.
No, it wouldn't be controlled in the definition.
Well,
in the definition of the conversations that I've had throughout over the last 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
And I guess like the impact it would have on like native fauna and flora, like that low, small, patchy one would work. You talked about, going on actually the word patchy. What is this patchwork technique and how is that applied? Yeah,
so patchy is the way that we describe the behavior of a fire. So you might have a reserve or a treatment area for a fire that is a certain size, but you might not burn it 100%, right? You might not apply fire to 100% of that area. The fires that we set in York Gum Woodlands as part of my PhD, the average across those sites, the average burn area was somewhere between 10 and 40% of the entire treatment site.
Right.
And the spatial, I guess, component of that is that some areas, there was maybe like some 2x2 areas that were completely burnt, and then some areas where a very small trickle of fire just trickled through it. So sort of uneven as well. And I guess part of that is the exclusion of individual plants and species and trees in particular from flames. So I can remember one burn where Uncle Aidan Eads and his sister Auntie Liza Woods walked the area and pink flagging taped particular plants that they did not want burnt.
Right. Okay.
And then they said to the ranger team, the Now and Up Enterprises caretakers who were going to be the boots on the ground, I guess. They said, okay, we'll light the fire here and you guys need to watch it and make sure that you exclude this parang tree or that whatever tree and rake around this tree. And so it's a really specific decision making, which is impossible to do.
Do you know why some of those reasons were?
For the particular plants? Just due to the relationship and that people hold with those plants, I suppose, which is probably for them to disclose.
Yeah. And in terms of like the ecology, like keeping like the best way of the ecosystem, the diversity and all that, like, because that's also providing sort of refuge areas for the flora and also for the fauna to move out.
Yeah, particularly invertebrates. We see a lot of invertebrates moving around the fireground, and I have a great photo of one of the kids that was present on the fireground one day holding a bobtail that had crawled out of the fire zone. So creating, refugia, also ensuring persistence of plant resources for people and animals. So when we went through and counted all the cultural plant species that were in the burn areas before and after, we saw that although we saw quite a bit of change in other groups of species, for cultural plant species, there actually wasn't a lot of change in their abundance, even after a fire. So I guess, caring for those, the persistence of those resources after the fire as well.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ensuring their continuance.
Yeah, because especially like how they would have moved around the country if they just burnt everything, and then the next mob to come through would just have nothing. So and there's definitely some plants that we know were intentionally burnt at particular times for proliferation, for example. But what's that?
To increase them.
Oh, okay.
But that there's sometimes a delay on that as well. So maybe for the first 2 years you don't see that, and then it's in the third year that you harvest it, for example. So you also have to know where other patches are and what their time since fire is to understand where to live successfully, I guess, in the landscape.
Yeah, because if things aren't burnt for a long period of time either, that eventually if it does get burnt, it just sort of takes out everything, the velocity.
It depends. It depends on the vegetation community type, I suppose. Like there's some argument for biomass accumulation without disturbance, but there's also mechanisms that deal with that are outside of fire as well. I guess there's some research to suggest that, obviously increases, like, since that fire consumes all of the proportion of the biomass. And then after fire, so you're starting from a 0 point, which is obviously not zero, there's still biomass there, but and then you get this increase. But then there's some research to suggest that it actually gets to a certain point and starts to decrease again, like that the activity in the soil is breaking down that dead material, and then things like bioturbators.
Which was going to bring on to my next, I think something I learned the other day was like a lot of our native fauna, like quinders, or like, which are bandicoots, for the global audience. I don't know how you could really describe them apart from being like a rabbit
small
cross.
marsupial-y things.
Yeah, like a rabbit cross a rat kind of thing. But like neither one of those species, but they are a little marsupial. And they when you mean bioturbators, is the ones that sort of dig up the soil and change over the layering, and that increases the biodegradation of the leaf litter in there, which keeps that fuel source a lot more of a sustainable level. But then we've got because obviously a lot of our marsupials are in quite dire straits. Yeah, especially with the pests of cats and foxes and all that. So like the ecosystem's starting to get a little bit out of balance, where if we had all these, if everything was like left untouched, it would still be perfectly fine. But we're coming across different pressures and things now, which is that taken into account when burning? And then I want to follow that up with like, when should we be burning? Like, what are the sort of more, I know as we've learned through this, it's like very, there's a lot of considerations with like types of plants, when they're flowering, when the times of year, so some seasons aren't missed. But when is typically the best times of year to burn, or when they start looking to burn?
Yeah, so that study that we did that I just talked about, walking 2 kilometres and recording what you might look for, we found that overwhelmingly it's that autumn period. So Arnie would call that Burnera, and I have permission to use that language and to share this, that she talks about burning after the first autumn rains.
Right. Okay.
And in that study, the plant data, I guess, that we matched up to the ecological knowledge that was held by the Knapp family showed really clearly that there was this window from sort of late March to early May that there was much less presence of things that would restrict application of fire, or presence of plants that would restrict application of fire. So I think from sort of October through to February, there's something like 60% of our observations of cultural plants were in a phase where the Noongar knowledge of stewardship would restrict application of fire to them. And then from late March to May, it was less than 10% of the observations were in those phases. So flowering or fruiting or whatever that might be. So it was a really clear seasonal distinction. And then there was also a distinction across the vegetation communities that we walked through. And in the more fertile and less species-rich communities, so sort of eucalypt woodlands that we worked in, there was like quite a clear period and quite clearly not many species that were restricting fire at that time. And then in more species-rich and a little bit more floristically complex landscapes, such as those associated with granite outcrops, there was still species throughout that time, even though there was less of them and less things restricting fire. There was still restrictions on fire at a metre by metre scale.
Right. That's a really small scale.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with that time of year, is our current regimes matching that, or is it like quite different?
Yeah. So Southwest Australia has a Mediterranean type climate, like hot, dry summers and cold, wet winters. And fire managers apply controlled fire throughout the cooler seasons of the year. So from what we would call autumn, winter and spring. And I think it would be okay for me to say that for a lot of the elders that I've spoken to, spring application of fire is really concerning to them.
Well, that's when everything's sprouting and budding and you're just like,
exactly.
If you're burning then, I would imagine like those plants aren't well adapted to be able to survive a fire.
Yeah, well, I think at least since we've had the current sort of climate conditions, it would be quite unusual to have a fire in spring, particularly in the wetter parts of the state, and through natural ignitions. And yeah, definitely the plants and animals like emerging post-winter is a big consideration for elders in that. And the ecological data also sort of speaks to that as well. There's been some really interesting and great work done looking at plant responses to unseasonal fires across Mediterranean type climates, where, the spring fires really harms particularly germination of fire-killed species, which rely on seed germination after fire, because you don't get that cool, wet period after fire. If you have a spring fire, you go into the hot summer period. And the soil is then left bare through that dry period, which can also have problems, erosion and whatever. Not whatever. But yeah, so there's a concern about that practice, I guess, but then there's also ecological data, that biological data that backs that up as well.
I guess it's hard to speak on a global view, but for Southwest Australia, are we moving into that more of a practice that's like more ecologically minded than? Then what it is? By that pause, I'm going to sort of assume.
I guess that's not my job. I don't do that. I don't make those decisions. I think, generally we're more aware of the environment and the impacts that we're having, and also the impacts that we're having in the climate change scenarios. And I think that's what's driven a lot of the work that I just spoke about on a seasonality of fire, is that in the southwest, we have a really long drying trend, and that has extended the flammable time that certain parts of the landscape are flammable across the year. So trying to understand what that means for persistence of particularly sensitive species, or species that have really restricted ranges. For example, tingle trees that are restricted to the south, like sort of Walpole area.
Yeah.
What does that change in
There's
fire?
only so many. It was like they could count individually, right? How many are left of the tingle trees? Is that like the tree that's like almost gone?
Yeah,
Is
it has a very small range. Yeah.
Yeah. One of your studies observes a difference in the inherent understanding of fire between participant groups. How does Noongar language linking fire with home illustrate a worldview where fire is intrinsic, and how does this contrast with the non-Noongar tendency to position fire as extrinsic, risky, and out of control?
Yeah, so something I often reflect on is, as a key learning personally for me, is that prior to doing this work and to being taught by so many knowledgeable elders and knowledge holders, I, through my cultural experience, drew a line between fire in a hearth or a fireplace or a fire pit or a campfire and landscape fire, right? You either have fire for cooking on and for sitting around, or landscape fire. And through working with elders, I came to understand that they didn't draw the same line that I drew. And I really had to rethink about how I framed controlled landscape fire, because for a lot of the people I was talking to, the line was somewhere else. It was sort of like there's hearth and campfires, there's controlled landscape fire, and then there's uncontrolled landscape fire. So small, slow, controlled landscape fire was sort of considered in the same breath as campfires, which was quite foreign to me. And I think talks to your question of how people perceive fire in the landscape. And fire is dangerous, and it can be risky, and people die, and it's scary. I'm a volunteer firefighter, and it's scary to be on the fire line. But there's also landscape fire that's not scary, that you have old people and children around for, and that is part of your obligation to country. And it was that bit that I didn't know about, and that I was lucky enough to experience, I suppose.
Right. Okay. What are some of the primary hurdles currently preventing the reapplication of Noongar Indigenous fire knowledge, and the ranging from perceived risks of overgrown areas and legislative requirements like obtaining burning permits?
Yeah, there's many. Primarily access to land and land ownership rights is the main one, particularly for Noongar folk who in the southwest of Western Australia, they have a native title settlement agreement. So in other parts of Australia, particularly in remote Australia and the central Australia and northern Australia, Indigenous and First Nations groups have had exclusive native title access to country, and that's not a perfect system, but it has enabled access and burning rights for a lot of groups. In the southwest, that doesn't exist. So access to and rights to apply fire to country is the single biggest thing that we can, as allies, assist with, I suppose. And that includes things like permits. So in the landscape that we work in, we find that in the permitting period, farmers are given permits for burning stubble, but no one will give us a permit for burning in the bush.
Right.
So then we have to wait till the permit-free period, and then it's too late. There's orchids or things coming up that you can't apply fire to. So simple things like that. Insurance is a big thing we talk about a lot. If you don't own the country, are you doing fire as a fee-for-service work? What's the arrangement around that? Who's paying for insurance? How are workers insured? What if the fire gets out? Who's insured for that sort of stuff? Something we talk about a lot that you just wouldn't think about.
Yeah, I've never even thought about that side of it.
I think in Southwest Australia, the length of colonial occupation and the impact on landscapes tends to mean that the terra nullius kind of myth, or the myth that people didn't care for this place or use it or know about it in any kind of sophisticated way, persists more than in other regions in Australia that are potentially less or have had a different colonial timeline. And so that, I think, is also a barrier, like a perceptions around continuance of Indigenous knowledge and connections to place and those sorts of things held by non-Indigenous Australians is a significant barrier.
Right. With the first elder-led Noongar burn in the Shire of Denmark, which is not the Denmark country, the one in the southwest Australia, in Western Australia, it was one of the first in many decades. What did you see as the most meaningful outcome for the people, land and culture?
Yeah, so that was one of the results of that work that we did in Denmark. I think for me, probably there's a couple of things. And it includes sort of overcoming what I was just talking about, like this collaboration between the Volley Fire Brigade and elders and their grandkids who work as rangers, to this realization that, hey, actually we both care about looking after this place and making sure that people are safe here, realizing that there was that common ground and just establishing those relationships so that could keep happening, I suppose.
Right. You've used a mix of methods and interviews, mapping, monitoring. Looking ahead, how do you envision the methodological next step for cultural fire research, capturing both social and ecological dimensions?
Yeah, I think transdisciplinary research is really important, particularly in fire. Like, there's a lot of fields of research related to fire, right? Like fire ecology, fire behavior, fire safety. We often don't communicate that well to each other. And then obviously, the social and governance side of things, like I've just talked about, don't really sit within my expertise, but are a really important part of this story. I think that in our little collaboration in the Fitzsterling, which is, really between university researchers, elders and their families, and conservation organisations working in that region, we're in a really exciting position that we have sort of established this network. We've been working together on fire for 4 or so years, and there's a lot of opportunity for experimental management now, I think. Like, in that landscape in particular, it's very fragmented. And we know that in fragmented landscapes, fire regimes tend to be changed in both directions, sort of, more or less fire, depending on what's going on around the reserve and what kind of vegetation the reserve has. So we're at so there's a lot of management challenges, I guess, in relation to that, and management pressures as well from being, from having crop on sides of your reserve and wanting to maintain like engage, I guess, with the hazard of wildfire. So there's we're at an exciting point for experimental management, I think, and bringing together ecological knowledge and also Noongar knowledge of country to explore how we might restore some places and look after others.
With all your experience, has there been a particular moment that you that you've absolutely been as one of your favourite moments?
The whole thing.
The whole thing.
It's honestly, it makes me want to cry thinking about how lucky I feel to work with people I get to work with in the country that I get to work on and with and learn from, and the relationships that I've been able to build with all the collaborators that have worked, particularly on my PhD research. A light bulb moment for me, which is also quite, I don't know, maybe entertaining. It was, we went back in September to a burn site in York Gum Woodlands, so the very southern extent of York Gum Woodlands that we worked in, and we had 36 microplots in a number of burn sites, and we were recording, every living thing in each of those little plots, and it was a really hot September day, like unseasonably hot, and we pulled up for lunch, and I was doing something, and I looked over, and the camp chairs and the esky had been dragged into the centre of the study site. And as an ecologist, my first reaction was, "Oh, you can't! What? No, don't walk in there." And then I thought, how ridiculous! Like, this is exactly part of the process of caring for country, spending time in it. And also, the coolest and most comfortable place to eat lunch was in the centre of the area that we'd burnt, under a big tree that we'd cleaned up around. It was green and damp and just beautiful, and everywhere else had sort of 25 centimetres of dry wallaby grass. And yeah, it was just like the most, it was just like, of course this is the most lovely place to sit. We've been looking after it for the last 2 years. This makes that's like gardening. Yeah.
Wow, that is actually a great moment to think. I could totally understand where that first scientist mind come in and you're like, and then realising exactly that. So
it's exactly part of the experimental disturbance.
Yeah.
What's the point of caring for that place if you have no intention of spending time in it?
Wow. That's a great way to end the podcast too on that note. Thank you so much for coming in today. It's been really eye-opening, and it's great to hear that these conversations have started to integrate the two, and hopefully we're coming to some better outcomes in the future. And thank you for coming all the way up from the southwest as well to join on me up here.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Paramount importance. This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff.